Suspension tuning is widely regarded as a black art, but it doesn't have to be. This is the Annex Suspension Podcast.
My name is Ezekiel from Annex Suspension.
And my name is Tyler, also with the Annex Suspension Group.
Okay, Tyler, I have an interesting question for you. So my enthusiast background consists of classic Toyota. And the reason I bring this up, when we're buying and selling old shock absorbers, one common test that people used to do is flip the shock upside down and then compress the body, the rod back into the body. And they'd bring it back up and the rod would not come back up, and they'd say, oh, your shocks are blown. And for me, I don't know how to describe it, but I know for a fact that like some older shocks, that's just normally how they work. They'll have compression pressure, but the center portion won't normally go up by itself. Why is that?
Well, you do bring up a really good point, and this is something that exists in different things. And a perfect example is I actually discovered this for the first time myself, and to me, what was a modern application when I started playing around with the front struts that were over 400,000 miles old on my Corolla when I got it. Same thing, I flipped it over, compressed it, shock shaft didn't come out. But those shocks weren't blown. Just because you don't have a compression force pressing the shaft back out doesn't mean it still doesn't handle what the job of the strut is. Remember, the job of the strut or shock is to control the motion of the spring. A lot of times, why you see that test as the common way to do it is most shocks nowadays have a nitrogen pressure that pressurizes it, and that's what will cause them to rebound like that.
If I understand you right, the only shocks that'll have the shock rod or shock shaft come back out have to be gas filled.
Pretty much. It's highly unlikely that you'd see, again, perfect examples, an old fluid filled damper. So an oil filled only damper has no forces to press it back out.
Oh, okay. That's a really good point.
And like I said, perfect example, the OEM dampers on the front of my 8.6 when I got it, that's what I was like, oh, these are totally blown. Then when I opened up the strut casing and poured out a lot of oil, it clicked with me that I was like, oh, these were fluid-filled dampers.
Yeah, so for the listeners who aren't familiar with like an older style shock absorber, you could actually open up the case and you actually had to fill up oil and put in a body inside. Whereas nowadays it's... I would say majority of all shock absorbers are sealed units now. You're not supposed to take it apart.
No, and that's because of that same pressure, that same nitrogen pressure. Pressure can cause accidents or it can cause things to move. So you have to be very aware. And that's also why a lot of things that you have will have seals on them saying contents under pressure, don't open, or if open, voids warranty, all that fun stuff.
Do not put next to a flame.
Oh, yeah. Don't put in your face or eye. Yeah.
So another thing, some lexicon that commonly gets confused, strut, shock, and damper.
Yep. So the reason why damper comes into play is because that's what its job is. It's dampening the force and the motion of the spring. So they're all dampers. But what's that big difference between a shock and a strut, right? You might even hear McPherson strut, etc. Realistically, it's more of about a part designation difference. A good example is if you're driving down the street behind a big lifted truck, you will see shocks that are bolted to the rear axle. You actually can see the shock body. It's outside of the spring. A strut has a spring perch as part of the shock body. So it's typically inside the spring. And that's what's mostly common on modern cars today.
Can we repeat that?
Absolutely.
Even I didn't really grasp that. Can we
Cool.
go over
Yeah.
that one more time?
So the best way to think about it is they're all dampers. Every job they have is to arrest or damp the motion of the spring. Now, that's because the spring's job is to keep your car at one height going down the road. And again, it's just controlling that motion. Realistically, though, there is a difference between a shock and a strut. The easiest example we've almost all seen is if you're driving down the road behind a truck, you can usually see the shock bolted to the axle, the body of the axle. That is outside of the spring and it's independent. That's usually how you can designate a shock. A strut typically has a spring perch welded to the shock body. So, like a coil over, the strut has its damper actually running inside the spring.
Cool. A shock is outside and independent of the spring.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Another common phrase that gets thrown around is, my shocks are blown. What does that actually mean?
Well, it goes back to what their job is. If you're going down the road and you hit a bump, if the spring's job is to keep you at one height, it doesn't realistically absorb that motion. It does slightly, but it's going to try to return to the same height it was at. You have to have something to stop that spring motion. That's what the job of the strut shock damper. That's what it's supposed to do, is to stop that motion. If you hit a bump and your car just keeps on moving, it's a pretty good indication that your shocks are blown.
So we're here at the Annex facility, how do I know if my coilovers are blown? I have some really nice name brand, but kind of older coilovers. How do I know if they're blown or not?
So that's a good point. And the nice thing about coilovers is typically they have serviceable components. However, the important thing to know about coilovers is how they were used. The standard industry service interval for shocks and struts is about 60,000 miles. That still seems pretty realistic for something that sees only street use. However, if it's a relatively aggressive kit, the car's been lowered, the spring rate's been upped quite a bit, you cut it in half. Probably about 30,000 miles is more realistic a time frame. Then, if you start seeing track time, or if the car is used off-road or in aggressive situations where those damper forces are controlling more motion more regularly, again, this is where high-end shocks may only last 1 year, 10,000 miles at most.
So you talked a little bit more about service intervals. What I'm really trying to get at is, like, I have these coilovers on my car.
Right.
How do I know if they're any good or not? At least like the damper portion of my coilovers.
Gotcha.
Like, when I'm driving, what am I feeling in my car if I know, like, the damper parts
Well,
blown
here's
or bad?
a good thing to know is that the number one thing they always tell you to do to test your shocks is that good old bounce test, right? You get your buddy, you lean on the corner, you bounce the shock. Unfortunately, with aftermarket coilovers, spring rates might be so high that the car might not continue to bounce.
Yeah.
The amount of force that you can compress that 10, 12, 14 kilogram spring may not be enough to keep it being a good test. This is where, when you're actually driving the vehicle, you're going to have to pay attention to a little bit more about behavior. Number one giveaway is the same between aftermarket or stock suspension: tire wear. How is your tire wearing? If you've got what they call cupping, which is kind of almost takes like someone looks like they took a spoon and kind of took scoops out of the sidewall, the side of the tire as it's going down.
The tread of my tire, right?
Yes, the tread, not the sidewall.
Someone took the ice cream scooper and scooping out my tire.
That's cupping, and that is a perfect indication of a shock that is either dead or has a dead spot in its range. Effectively, what's happening is your wheel is kind of dribbling down the road like a basketball, and that's one of the reasons you're getting uneven tire wear, which plays directly into another factor. If your tires aren't constantly staying in contact with the road, you're going to lose braking performance. And that's another reason why having them shocks working well, or if they're starting to go bad, if you start increasing your braking distance, that's another way to tell.
Wow, that's really good. I notice my braking distance increases, it could be because my dampers are worn.
Yeah, they can play a role in it as well.
Wow.
So not only is your braking distance decreased, you might actually have a lean or a dip or a squat on one end of the car when it shifts weight.
Oh, and that's how you would know, like, that corner is worn.
Exactly. So a perfect example is, I know that if I brake too hard, in my car right now, the right front is the first to dip and the last to settle.
Oh, man.
So I know that strut is on its way.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, this totally blew my mind. What am I going to do now, Tyler? So my braking distance increased. My wheels going down the road like a basketball. Someone's scooping out the tread of my tires now. What am I going to do with these blown coilovers?
Well, a lot of different manufacturers make replacement parts. So a lot of aftermarket coilovers can be serviced. And keep in mind, even the newer style coilovers do contain oil. Oil eventually wears out, and again, that's why you have these service intervals. A fresh change of oil in the coilover can also help it function a little bit better. All the Annex stuff in-house is serviceable. We keep parts on hand, and we've also done some durability testing to see just how long our stuff lasts. But usually you want to reach out to the manufacturer of that coilover and see if they offer a rebuild service.
Tyler, thank you again for being on the podcast. That was a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, it's just kind of that compounded interest of having learned it the hard way over time.
So hopefully we'll have more podcasts like this where our listeners won't have to learn the hard way like we did.
Yeah. Sharing best practices and info for everyone.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thank you. The Annex Suspension podcast is AM Auto House.